Now we've talked about investigating outbreaks, I want to move on to talking about clusters. So I have two talks. The first one is going to focus really on how clusters can occur. And the second one is going to be more about methods that we use to investigate clusters. So let's start with this figure. So basically here we have 100 squares and 200 points distributed across the squares. So if we're in a classroom, my question to you would be, do you think there's clustering in here of the points? And you might make up your mind on that. But then I would tell you that the distribution of the points on the grid pattern is random. This is a random distribution of points, 200 points across 100 squares. So now I say, do you think that there's clustering going on? So what do you think? Sort of make up your mind before I tell you whether or not there is or not. So if you're a typical class, when I tell you it's a random distribution of points across the squares, you would have said, oh well, no, there can't be clustering. But there is clustering. And you can see, I mean, it's intuitively obvious. There is clustering. So around here and around here. So some squares have 6, or I think in this one it's got 7, the maximum number, and others have none. So the thing is that, and I'll come back to this, I'll say this several times, clustering can occur by chance alone. And that is actually important insight into understanding why some clusters do occur, clusters of disease in populations. The question is, how can we distinguish a distribution of points that is purely randomly distributed, from a distribution of points that has some special clustering? And for that purpose, the Poisson distribution is very useful. So I don't like to have too much math in this class, but the Poisson distribution is actually not nearly as formidable as it may look at first glance, and it's a very useful distribution in terms of deciding whether or not something unusual is happening in terms of clustering. So we have starting on this side of the equation, we have m. M is the total number of subdivisions, which in this example was 100. And then we have lambda, the Greek letter lambda. And lambda is the expected number of hits per subdivision. So basically, we just divide the total number of hits by the total number of subdivisions, which in this example was 200 divided by 100, which is, of course, 2. So those are the main things. So we have m and lambda, and also we have e, the natural number e, but then we have k. So k, we can vary k. So we can start, so on the other side of the equation, n of k is the number of squares in the grid which contain k points or k hits. So we can vary k. We can calculate n of k for n of 0 and then keep on going up as far as we want. Practically, we might not want to go much past sort of n of 8 or n of 7, because there was a maximum of 7 points in the previous of 7 points in any square in the grid that I just showed you. Okay, so we carry out this this calculation 7 or 8 times, each time varying k from 0 up to say 7, and then for each of those calculations we calculate the number of expected squares with a number of hits. So we can set it out in this way. So first of all, here we have the expected, and this is based entirely on the Poisson distribution. So if we put k equals 0 here, we calculate 14. K equals 1, we calculate 27, and so on and so on. And it all sums to 100. And then we compare it with our observed, which is just basically by counting the number of squares with each number of hits from the diagram, and then we set it out here. And then we can compare at every level of k the expected and the observed. and you can see it's fairly obvious that the observed is very similar to what you would expect under the Poisson distribution. And you can carry out a statistical test of whether or not these two are similar or different, but in this instance we probably don't need to, because it's pretty obvious that the expected and the observed distributions are very similar. So we can say on that basis that it looks like that pattern that we observed in that figure was actually just what we might expect in terms of a random distribution. And this, I took this example from my colleague Steve Selvin's book, Statistical Analysis of Epidemiologic Data, one of the few textbooks in epidemiology which actually has a chapter on cluster investigation, and I have borrowed from that chapter reasonably liberally in preparing these talks. So what, you might say? So we find the expected and the observed are very similar, but that's just a bunch of points on a bunch of squares. So let's have a look at this again, and let's try and imagine it differently. Imagine, for example, that this is a bunch of city blocks, so that you know in New York that the avenues go one way and the streets go another way. So you can think of this as a bunch of city blocks, and you could think of each of these points as being the number of cases of a particular cancer. So just for the sake of the example, we'll say cases of breast cancer, so that occur on each of these blocks in different apartments and houses. So if you were a person living in this particular block here, and you looked around you and you would say, there's so many people, so many women have come down with breast cancer around me in recent times that I really think something is going on and it needs to be investigated. On the other hand, if you happen to live in these blocks, particularly this one, which is more isolated from that, you might say, well, no problem, nothing's going on. You wouldn't even think about it. You wouldn't even think about it. Over here, you might think something was going on. And anyway, if you were a person over here, you might contact the authorities and say this is a really unusual event, because in the blocks next door, in the three blocks, say, adjoining, there's only one case, and we have 7. Something is going on. So this is what happens with clusters. They can draw attention to themselves, and the problem is it's very difficult to know whether or not this is a spontaneous event, and just what you might expect by looking at the pattern as a whole, or whether something really is going on down there. But nonetheless, these clusters, which are essentially spontaneously occurring or can be predicted by the Poisson distribution, they draw attention to themselves, because in reality cases of disease are not evenly spread. They're not evenly spread. They're going to be, they fluctuate a great deal across any population, even if there's not something going on locally. So the problem is that chance is very lumpy. It doesn't sort of evenly spread things out. Now this is a phenomenon, the people drawing attention to a number of events happening in a local area. And it can also happen, I'm talking here mainly in terms of in geographic terms, but time can also come into this. A number of things can happen in time. They may be compressed, and a number of events may be compressed in a certain time frame, whereas in other time periods nothing is happening. Again, it's simply can be just a representation of the Poisson distribution, which equally applies to area as it does to time. So this phenomenon of drawing attention to a particular area, because there seems to be an unusual pattern of clustering going on, is called the Texas sharpshooter effect. And so it refers to this cartoon cowboy who shoots at a door and then goes and draws the bullseye around it. So really this is what's happening. Something happens, it's kind of random, as this guy is obviously not a very good shot, and basically, and then it becomes the center of the target. It becomes the bullseye. A lot of attention focuses on it. So that's the Texas sharpshooter effect, and it's a very common phenomenon. But it's very hard to distinguish clusters that occur because of this effect from clusters that occur because there's something genuinely unusual going on. And clusters caused by something unusual do occur. So anyway, my point here is that clustering occurs by chance alone, just because random events are not uniformly distributed. And we really need to be careful when we draw our space and time boundaries. So the example show just had a space boundary, but also by just drawing a circle around that cluster in the bottom left-hand corner, we focus on that. But really, the appropriate boundary would have been the whole city, not just that particular block. But we also need to be very careful about the time boundaries. So we can because health events occur in populations in a very kind of lumpy way. Then if we just narrow the time boundaries around when a number of cases seem to occur, then we can inappropriately focus on something that was just really an expected phenomenon. If we'd looked at it in terms of a broader time frame, then we wouldn't have thought anything particularly unusual was going on. So, but the problem is, we can do that, but is it really a true cluster? Something unusual happening. There's something really unusual happening. Now, I want to talk about an event that I was involved in, and I think illustrates quite well how clusters can occur. And so this was back in 96, when I lived in New Zealand and working as an epidemiologist. And New Zealand, as many countries have done, changed over to unleaded gasoline, and it was a progressive change over a period of time, and there was opposition to it from many people, particularly vintage car enthusiasts, because the lead in the gasoline actually it lubricated valve seatings, and they were very opposed to this changeover because it meant they were going to have to use some new additive, and it was inconvenient. They didn't want this changeover to occur, and there was quite a bit of publicity, and people, other people were saying maybe it could be unsafe. We didn't know what it would do to engines and so on. Anyway, in the first 3 months of 96, it kind of built up. There were a number of reports in the media of motor vehicles bursting into fire and fuel line failures, and this was alleged to be caused by the new unleaded gasoline, and it actually became a major crisis for the government because they'd invested a lot of money in making this changeover, and so had the oil companies which supplied the gasoline. So there was a lot of concern, and the government was not really clear what to do. So anyway, I watched all of this on TV, and I thought, well, I have an idea of what's really going on. And so the next morning I went to the Ministry of Energy, which was really managing the gasoline changeover, and I had some contacts there, and I talked to them, and I said that really I wasn't quite clear that there really was anything unusual going on, and if they could help me obtain some data, then we would be able to investigate this fairly promptly. So they were very helpful, and the speediest grant money I ever got in my life came my way within days, and also they put pressure on a number of agencies to supply me with some data. And so what we obtained, my colleague Nick Garrett and I, we obtained data on fire service attendants at motor vehicle fires. The fire service maintained a database on that, and also insurance claim data for motor vehicle fires. and we needed as a denominator the annual numbers of registered motor vehicles in New Zealand. So we carried out this relatively simple longitudinal and in fact descriptive analysis, and I just want to show you what we did and show you how relatively easy it can be to investigate some of these hypotheses. So we looked at the number of motor vehicle fires attended by the New Zealand Fire Service, starting from 1989 right through into this first quarter of 1996. And you can see that although there's fluctuations, sort of somewhat random fluctuations, there's nothing very unusual going on in this first quarter. So they weren't really being called out to more motor vehicle fires than would be expected. And then we looked at insurance claims and for vehicle fire damage. And so we just took the first quarter of each year for 6 years, and we broke it down by month. So we have here January, February and March. And you can see, in fact, if anything, there's a slight downward trend from 1991 to 1996. There's no pattern by month, and there's nothing unusual going on in terms of the number of motor vehicle fires for which claims are made. And you can expect claims to be made. If somebody's car catches on fire, then they are going to make a claim. So we felt that these data were pretty robust. So what was going on? So why all the fuss about motor vehicle fires, and why was this attracting so much attention? Why did it become a crisis? So I'll tell you what I think happened. There was some opposition, some concern about the changeover to unleaded gasoline, and we calculate that around 1,000. Based on our data, we calculated that around about 1,000 motor vehicle fires occur in New Zealand every year, maybe a few more than that, but anyway, around about that number. And so most people, and these can often be spontaneous, maybe fuel line failures, but they occur. And the thing is that they're sufficiently rare that nobody is likely to have more than one happen to them probably in their lifetime. So if you're a person and you have your car, the engine suddenly burst into flames, this would likely never have happened to you, and so you'll be puzzling over what it could be. And if you're somebody who decided that maybe it's connected, because this is such an unusual thing, never happened to me before, and very recently they changed over the gasoline. So maybe that's what it was. And you contact the news media, and the news media always looking for a story, so they publicise it, and then other people read that, and they say, oh, that happened to me too. So and it's never happened to me before. So they get in touch, and if there happens to be a television program which is making a special focus on this, then you can pull all these people together and giving personal testimony on TV about how their car burst into flames and it had never happened to them before. So and you line up several people and it looks extremely convincing. And so it has a snowballing effect. It has a snowballing effect. And so more and more people come forward, which seems to reinforce the hypothesis that something unusual is going on. But in fact, all you're really seeing is the manifestation of an expected phenomenon. But normally it wouldn't attract any attention. It just so happened that in this particular instance, something unusual, a unique change had happened to the gasoline. So I use this example from my own experience just to illustrate how clusters can arise. Sort of people focus on a number of concurrent health events that are similar. They may even go out and track down more of them, and they compile them and they present them, and people who and they're probably rare events that people are not used to seeing, but if they're presented through the news media, it can appear that something very unusual is going on. So I mention that as a sort of salutary experience. This is the sort of thing that can happen in various ways. So if you are confronted with a disease cluster, think about whether or not it could have occurred through some mechanism such as I just described. Now, I would not want to give the impression that cluster investigation is useless, although some people will argue that it is not worth expending scarce public health resources on, and I won't get into that argument, but you should just be aware that some people would argue that. Other people, particularly public health officials who face the news media flack, will say that they really have no choice but to investigate them. And also I want to conclude this talk by saying that there have been a number of epidemiologically very important clusters, but these have always involved rare diseases. And so this is a listing, not necessarily a complete listing of all the important clusters, but some well-known ones. So in people who are manufacturing polyvinyl chloride plastic, and they manufacture it from the vinyl chloride monomer, which is polymerized, and a few cases, there are really only a very few, just sort of 2 or 3 cases of this very rare cancer of the liver angiosarcoma occurred. So this is a cancer of the lining of the blood vessels in the liver, and it is quite distinctly different from the much more common hepatocellular carcinoma that occurs and can be caused by things like alcohol and hepatitis and so on. Another one, phocomelia. We'll come back again to this in my next talk as an example. Phocomelia was a very rare birth defect caused by thalidomide, given to women in the end of the 50s and early 60s to prevent morning sickness. It was an extremely rare condition and attracted attention to itself. Vaginal adenocarcinoma, which is associated with this synthetic estrogen, diethylstilbestrol, or DES as it's usually known as, and this is, as far as I'm aware, the only known human what we call transplacental carcinogen, because women took this particularly in the 60s for threatened spontaneous abortion to prevent that, and it was quite effective, but later on their teenage daughters, with whom they were pregnant at the time, a number of them were diagnosed with this very rare cancer, adenocarcinoma of the vagina. So it's such a rare cancer. When they carried out a case control investigation, the only thing that they could find was that all their mothers had been treated with DES while they were pregnant. Methylmercury, associated with Minamata disease in Japan, the methylmercury manufactured by microorganisms in the sea from mercury, which is discharged from industrial plants, causes a very unpleasant condition, Minamata disease. Legionnaire's disease, a rare form of pneumonia caused by Legionella pneumophila, which occurred following a American Legionnaires conference in Philadelphia in about, I think, 1976. AIDS, caused by HIV, and this came to attention from some 3 rare cases of pneumonia. They were rare because they were caused by the disease organism Pneumocystis carinii, which is commonly found in people's lungs, but very rarely caused pneumonia. And that, of course, subsequently was tracked down to being caused by HIV infection and being a consequence of AIDS. And then a cluster of rare cancer, mesothelioma, the lining of from the pleura, caused by a cluster occurred in Turkey, and it was associated with this unusual mineral, which was a form of asbestos called erionite. So that's my introduction to clusters, and basically I wanted mainly to show you that clusters occur by chance, and probably those are the majority of clusters, and so it always needs to be kept in mind that it's possible that in fact likely that it's a random event or a random clustering, but there's always the possibility that it could have been something, there could have been some common event or common exposure that occurred that caused these things. The thing is, though, it's always going to be very difficult to find anything if you have a relatively common, or at least not unusual disease such as lung cancer or breast cancer or bladder cancer, anything like that. Unless they're a very rare variant, they're not likely to be easily associated with any particular exposure. On the other hand, if it's a very rare condition and there does seem to be clustering, then there's a reasonable chance of finding some common disease cause. In my next talk, I'm going to talk about the various methods that can be used to investigate disease clusters.